When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Erudition Network. I am Eddie Phillips. This is our re-engagement with you. I have been out for a couple of weeks. If this is your first time joining us, again, I'm Eddie Phillips. I'm a strategic public historian with backgrounds in many different fields. And here, this is the Erudition Network, where we approach history as systems, and we look at things through psychology, information systems, military, and all of this stuff. We mix it all up, but it's all backed by Black history, and history that is not often taught or ignored or not really shared with us properly or factually. Tonight, I don't want to go too long in this intro. I want you to do two things. One, if you're new to the show, I want you to share this this program. This is an interactive, so you have the opportunity to come in and ask questions in chat. Also, I ask that you subscribe, push that button and subscribe to us here on YouTube, and also make sure that you're following us on Facebook and any of our other social media sites that we're on. This is a robust network that we're trying to build to teach Black history in its fullness and its factuality to everyone. We call it Black history but Black history really is world history, and it's something that we should all engage in. Tonight, I'm going to do a little bit of heavy lifting tonight, and that says like because I'm just getting back. Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most difficult subjects that I believe that you can cover in American history. The lynching and killing of, or the lynching and murdering or killing or historical killing of Black Americans, and the historical mistrust that has stayed with us because of that and still surrounds us. We're going to begin with the present, but we're not going to declare or talk about things that are unresolved in a way that we make a decision. No, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do, we're going to talk about actual facts and the evidence that has been established and things that have been done. I want you to understand why suspicions like when Black young men vanish or they end up unalived, where that came from, and whether some of the mechanisms surrounding the historical racial violence, where they come from and why they remain recognizable today. In order to do that, I will have to go work through a lot of history. I'll have to talk about Ida B. Wells and the Red Record and Southern Horse, along with the letter from Frederick Douglass about why are Black people lynched. We'll have to touch on some W.B. Du Bois, some Carter G. Woodson, and other writers such as Archibald Dunning, Charles Shufelt, Collins, and others who defended or helped to construct ideas about racial hierarchy, Black criminality during the eras of Reconstruction and all the way to where we are today, and to allow white authority to have reign. We need to understand both the historical side, and we need to understand the arguments that come along with it. And we need to expose the systems. That's really what we do here. Expose the system and the people honestly, without rationalizing it. And it's a lot to unpack. So I'm going to try to get through all of it. But as always, We are not going to sacrifice context for facts. We're just going to move a little faster and try to get through it. So let me begin with a question, because I like to open these sessions with a question. Sean Anthony, I see you're here. Thank you for joining us. When a Black person dies today under unusual or disputed circumstances, why do part of Black America sometimes immediately wonder whether we are looking at something much older like lynching outside of the official explanation and statements that are often given by police, by the law? And why does that happen? And that's kind of where we're going to begin tonight. And that's where we have to begin tonight, because these are things that happen all the time, right? Why are we still asking whether Black people are being lynched? And so I want to begin that tonight in the present, because the question that pushed me towards creating this episode and getting back did not begin in places like 1892 or in newspaper accounts about Jim Crow in the South. It began with something that I continue to see happening around us every day, daily. A Black person dies under circumstances that are disputed. There's confusion, there's violence, but not an immediate explanation. And almost before the investigation actually has started or even reached any kind of conclusions, somebody asks whether we are looking at another lynching, whether we're seeing a lynching. And sometimes that question is reasonable. Sometimes it moves ahead of the available evidence. That is true. But sometimes the eventual facts may demonstrate that the death was accidental, suicidal, criminal, or not racial, or the result of the circumstances that we may not know about. But yet that question still appears in the Black community. That question is still asked. And simply calling the people who ask it paranoid, that does nothing to explain why that mistrust exists. Insulting them and saying that they're stirring up racial animus or anger does not suggest that they're wrong in asking the question. And I want to make that very clear tonight, because as we look at these things, we have to be very clear about that. If we consider what happened recently around the death of Nolan Wells. Wells is that 18-year-old who he went and he traveled with his friends to, Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He didn't come back with the group, and his body was recovered a couple of days later. His family questioned aspects of what happened and asked for a deeper investigation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. They asked for an independent examination, and that was arranged by the family in order to establish if, in fact, this was a homicide. It is important that we allow families to do what they need to do. It's important that they be allowed to go investigate with pathologists and find out what's going on. The official state of the second examination restricted what could be concluded in many ways, but at the same time, it did not state unequivocally that this was not a homicide. And immediately, people on all sides, there was a temptation to choose a side before the evidence ever gave us permission to do so. One person looks at those facts and says, obviously something happened to him. That is obvious. Another looks at the same facts and says, obviously it was an accident. And neither word, obviously, belongs in the historical method that we're going to talk about tonight. An unresolved death does not become a homicide because people are suspicious. But uncertainty does not disappear because people would prefer closure. You can't wish it away. When a medical examiner uses the term undetermined, that has a specific forensic meaning. The cause of death identifies what disease, injury, or physiological process was responsible for death. And the manner of death legally classifies the circumstances in categories such as natural, accidental, suicide, or whatever also. But an undetermined finding does not secretly mean homicide, but it does not also mean that it wasn't a homicide. An unidentified finding simply says we don't know yet and we need to investigate. And that distinction is important because throughout this episode tonight, we're going to insist that words mean what they actually mean, especially when those words can change how the public interprets a dead person's life and how they died. We jump too quickly on all sides. Daniel Erving presents a different evidentiary situation. Erving was also an 18-year-old when he died in Lake Ray Hubbard in Texas in April of 2026. The Dallas County medical examiner concluded that he died from accidental drowning. According to the autopsy report, he entered the water, surfaced, called for help, and then became submerged. That's what they say happened. The conclusion has to be treated as part of the factual record, whether we find the surrounding circumstances suspicious or comfortable or not. Yet 2 teenagers were reportedly with Erving later those teenagers faced charges related to alleged evidence tampering, authority, and things that they may have done in the background. Authorities alleged that belongings were discarded, that the incident was not properly reported, and that communications were deleted. The medical examiner stated that there was no concurrent suspicions of foul play, while also noting that the classification could be changed if newer information emerged. Again, they didn't know based on what they looked at. But Erving's family has continued to ask for a fuller investigation, which is their right. Facts force us to practice a kind of thinking that the public debate often throws away or punishes because it refuses the comfort of going into simple thought camps. It is possible that Daniel Erving died by accidental drowning, or that the people around him did misbehave or did something to him that caused his demise, or that he passed and then they did something illegal. Evidence tampering is still illegal, even if it is not murder. Evidence tampering generally refers to intentional altering, destroying, concealing, or interfering with material that may matter in an investigation or a proceeding. And too often that has happened in the history we're going to talk about tonight. And this distinction brings us to the real subject that we got to talk about first. We are not defining every modern death as lynching. We are examining why some Black Americans do not automatically grant institutions the excuse or the benefit of the doubt to be historically innocent, because too often we have seen that that is not the case. The term institutional trust is the confidence people place in institutions such as your police department, your courts, right? Medical examiners, prosecutors, and historically Black people have been violated by these institutions. And Black families can disagree with a conclusion, yet believe that the process used to reach it was rigorous and fair. As they say, they have the right to believe that their child, loved one, did not harm themselves or did not put themselves in harm's way. That is absolutely their right. But what happens a lot is procedural justice. That's a concept in law and social studies where people's perceptions, or rather the process by which the authority is being used or exercised, is fair. Where the procedural justice that these people get, is it fair? And very often, as I told you, it is not. And when we think about the implications of that for Black historical experience, if a community has repeatedly encountered moments in which a sheriff knew who committed a killing, but arrest did not follow, or a jury refused to convict someone despite community knowledge and understanding that they did the crime, or newspapers and media repeated an accusation as though it was proof, that's a problem. You can't merely tell people who experience this to trust the process. It does not prove either way that something was corrupt or not corrupt. You have to investigate, and they have the right to ask for the investigation. That is why tonight, looking at Ida B. Wells' Red Record and Southern Horrors becomes essential to the modern conversation we're going to have. Not because she gives us convenient analogy, but because she developed a method of dealing with institutional certainty. Wells did not merely tell her audience that lynching was barbaric. She examined the stories behind them. And she used those stories to explain it. She compared accusations with records. She investigated specific victims. She tracked how newspapers and media described them. She examined when authorities intervened and when they did not. She categorized the reasons that were often offered for lynchings and questioned whether those reasons actually examined the pattern that was being documented. In the Red Record, she eventually moved beyond moral condemnation and insisted that the country confront the facts and evidence that were there, supporting everything she explored. What is this? This is an epistemological problem. Epistemological problems are part of a philosophy that is often concerned with knowledge itself, including how we know what we claim to know, what counts as evidence, and when belief is sufficiently justified to call it real or knowledge. She was doing that work in practical form. A newspaper says a Black man committed a crime. How does the newspaper know? Who told the reporter? A sheriff says a mob cannot be identified. Is that because nobody knows who participated in this very small town? Or is it because nobody's willing to talk? A politician describes lynching as a reaction to criminality. That Blacks are criminals, so this is what they deserve. Does the statistical record support that claim? That's the work that Ida was doing. And you have to notice how different that is from simply choosing which side we emotionally want to align ourselves with. Ida B. Wells was asking whether the story that explained the killing could survive contact with the facts and the evidence. Her work is essential and important in what we look at tonight, because we have to look at that. In Southern Horrors, she reproduced criticism from within Tennessee itself that described people being taken from official custody in full view of the community, the police, the courts, the sheriffs, and using authority that they did not have to murder someone. And those passages are important because it exposes a distinction between an unsolved crime and an unpunished crime. That's the difference we're going to talk about here. Is it unsolved or is it unpunished? Do we have evidence? The same point is explored in another writer we're going to talk about tonight, James Elbert Cutler. His early 20th century study, Lynch Law. Cutler was not Ida B. Wells, and we will not pretend that His writings didn't approach the subject the same way. But the difference actually makes the convergence important. Cutler recognized that public sentiment was central to the phenomenon of lynching and the permission to lynch or to kill. He observed that lynching usually occurred in an environment where the violence was approved, tolerated, encouraged, and excused, where people could do something and walk away from it and know they would not have anyone come after them. He believed that his record was substantial enough to reveal it as a broad pattern. That observation helps us begin separating a private situation from a social system of murder and killing. We'll define lynching much more thoroughly later as we go through this, but because it's a historical meaning that changed over time, it's just important that we express other folks who have looked at this. Because the important factor is impunity. Impunity meaning that the ability to commit wrongdoing while facing little to absolutely no consequences, no punishment. And that's where law and sociology and cultural understanding start to interact. That's where we start to peel about this system, because law establishes formal rules. Sociology asks how institutions and groups actually behave. Political science asks us the question, who possesses power to create and enforce those rules? Then psychology asks how expectations or rewards, punishments, and status is given to groups to approve or shape their individual behavior. In the end, history tells us rather these relationships, right, reoccur over time. Did they become systemic? Are they continuing? Have they evolved? None of those systems work alone. They all work together. And Ida Wells understood that interaction. That gives us a more sophisticated way to think about the mistrust. A community does not need to believe that every individual police officer, prosecutor, or whatever is corrupt in order to inherit distrust of a system. Institutions develop reputations through patterns, through history, through what I just told you. Those reputations can become outdated, exaggerated, and even unfair, which is why they must be continually challenged and tested when we have evidence. Psychology of it helps us understand both sides of the problem. There is a thing called confirmation bias. It's our tendency to notice, interpret, and remember information in ways that supports what we already believe. And too often in society, we are transformed by this confirmation bias. A person who believes racial violence is being concealed can interpret every uncertainty as a confirmation that something racial is happening. A person who believes racism is routinely exaggerated can interpret every family's suspicion as evidence of irrationality and playing the race card. Neither person has escaped bias simply because they think the other person is biased. The discipline comes from constructing a method strong enough to inconvenience our preferred conclusions and our bias. That's what facts are. That's why facts are important. That is why we have to do episodes like this, where we can distinguish evidence from interpretation. That is why I painstakingly go through it like this, because words should not become ritual phrases. There shouldn't be things that we repeat mechanically. It shouldn't become habits, because what happens is we shape our historical memory. That's the way that we in our communities remember, interpret, transmit, inform, commiserate, express, and sometimes suppress our past. It is different from history as a scholarly discipline, because history should be attempting to reconstruct or analyze the past through facts and evidence and sources. Historical memory is how that past continues living in our communities through the way our families, ourselves, our churches, our schools, our experience dictated. It's an inherited understanding that can easily be corrupted. And that distinction matters because memories can preserve truth and it can also preserve lies. That's why I threw in Carter G. Woodson tonight and why I'm throwing a little bit of Du Bois tonight, because they challenge these interpretations from another intellectual direction. They challenge people like Robert Schufelt, who tried to locate racial hierarchy in biology. They challenge people like Archibald Dunning, who tried to give an excuse for why blacks should be treated a certain way. They challenge people like Winfield Collins, who we'll talk about, who tried to explain racial violence through social conditions and claimed that blacks inherently had these behaviors. These writers disagreed. But beyond that, the facts disagreed with what was being put out. They approached it carrying prior beliefs about race, crime, sexuality, citizenship, and everything else. But some of them put aside their bias and a historical memory and tried to tell you earnestly by facts what was going on. And that's what we should do tonight and what we will do tonight. We have to ask the question, what does history require us to ask before we accept closure? If we have not worked our way through the legal architecture of how things happen in this country, with slavery, with Jim Crow, with our laws, we haven't even really worked through the struggle over Reconstruction. The racial science and historical interpretation that helped define Black people as a problem has not even been really looked at. The statistics of Ida B. Wells should be used to test explanations attached to lynching, to the psychology of crowds, to the economics of racial terror, to the transformation of public lynching across the entire life of America, and a modern distinction between private vigilantism and state authority. But it doesn't. We don't do that. That brings us back to kind of where we began. But we got to return to it a little bit differently now. The purpose of tonight, of moving through this history, was never to prove that every suspicious Black death in the present is a lynching. It is to understand why families sometimes distrust quick conclusions, why that distrust cannot simply be dismissed. Nolan Xavier Wells is a useful place to return to again, because his case remains unresolved. His body was found. His family continues to ask questions. The pathology and everything continues to ask questions. And the evidence does not establish yet that Nolan Wells was murdered. It certainly does not establish that he was lynched. But notice what has changed in a way we can analyze that case after some of the things I just told you. We no longer have to choose between declaring foul play and declaring the family's concern irrational. The proper historical and evidentiary position is that undetermined death is exactly what that term says it is. Undetermined, uncertainty. There is forensic uncertainty, where forensic medicine attempts to reconstruct and figure it out, but they haven't been able to. There are investigative questions that you can ask. The historical discipline requires us to be straightforward, even though the emotional situation compels us to make biased conclusions based on how we feel, based on our historical, as I told you earlier, our historical memory. But we have to be more disciplined. And as I go through more of this tonight, I wanted to come back to Nolan, and I wanted to touch on that because his case is still ongoing. Now let's consider something about Tyler Smith. You remember Tyler Smith? Maybe not. We finally have enough verified information on this case to kind of look at it conclusively. Smith was an 18-year-old recent graduate of Lafayette High School in Lexington, Kentucky. He died after suffering a gunshot wound early in the early morning hours of July 4th, 2026. Lexington police initially described the shooting as an accidental and self-inflicted. Smith's family strongly disputes that conclusion. Police later charged 28-year-old Bryce Chestnut with tampering with physical evidence after investigators determined that the firearm and shell casing recovered at the scene did not match. According to the police citations, Chestnut told investigators that he had handed his firearm to Smith and later removed that firearm from the scene without initially disclosing it to the officers. Smith's family has argued that these circumstances leave important questions unanswered, while police have said that the investigation remains ongoing. Again, we should resist allowing concerns to become a verdict, but the available evidence shows us some things. Tyler Smith was murdered. Tyler Smith was murdered. And the mistrust led people to investigate further. Even if it's not a lynching, it's made them investigate further. You remember how earlier I talked about the epistemological problem is across all of these cases, even though the mechanisms of death are different. Nolan was found in the water. That Erving was classified as an accidental driving, but people present were later accused of interfering with evidence, and then some were found to be interfering evidence. What they share is the presence of a disputed narrative and families asking whether all available evidence has been sufficiently examined. And that is important. And again, I will stress that is their right. And that goes back to that institutional trust that I talked about. We have to go back and look at people like Ida B. Wells and look at the investigative methods that were used by her and others to ensure that we do these things and we take the time to investigate these matters. Too often out here, we're presented with people. There's a certain pundit out here right now, calls himself an officer. I won't say his full name. And others who go out of their way to be apologists, to tell us we shouldn't ask those questions, to tell us it's not important for us to understand those things, to ignore the history that is out here, that occupies the space, that occupies our historical memory, as I told you earlier. And they go this way because they can, because often they are allowed to go this way because they are given reward. And it goes along again with a couple of months ago, as I talked about with these sellout alignments, where people are rewarded for doing and behaving in these ways. You may not see the reward, but I guarantee you there is something that is there for their performance. But we always have to ask why these people say, I don't agree with what happened, but, and it's always that but. How a society learns to explain racial violence in America is something we have to add into this discussion tonight also. We have to look into it. If the first part of our approach leaves us asking why Black Americans can look at an unresolved death today and still wonder whether the full story has been told, then the next question has to move deeper than the mistrust itself. What kind of intellectual environment teaches people how to explain a Black death once it happens? That is a different question. That's a different question from asking who pulled the trigger, who tied a rope, who hung someone to a tree, who joined a mob, who signed an order. Systems survive because violence is rarely left standing there naked alone. It is surrounded by explanation. Someone tells us what the victim supposedly did. Someone tells us about that victim's past, why that community should have been afraid, why the officer believed the force was necessary, why the citizen thought he had the authority to intervene with deadly force, why the social order was under pressure and could not in any way allow someone to take a water bottle out of a store, or why the people involved should be judged according to circumstances that the outsiders supposedly cannot understand. Some of that context can be legitimate. I can offer you some of that. Historical and legal analysis requires context. I will give you that. But there is a point at which context can begin doing something else. It can shift the center of our moral attention away from the person who exercised lethal force and power and murder toward the victim, toward the person who actually died. That is why the literature that we're talking about tonight and history we're talking about tonight matters. These books that we're touching on allow us to watch the construction of explanation rather than merely condemn its results. Winfield Collins is particularly useful because he does not begin his book, The Truth About Lynching and the Negro in the South, by telling the reader that murder is good. Now, he expressly insists that he is not attempting to justify lynching. Instead, he says he intends to present the conditions and what he calls is a circumstance offered to reduce how severely we judge an action without necessarily claiming the action. Winfield, he wanted to let us know extenuating circumstances exist. He wanted to let us know that extenuating circumstances have meaning. Reduce how we look at things. A frightened person reacting to an emergency may be judged differently from a person acting with calm forethought. The problem is, Collins applies that kind of mitigating framework to race. His method repeatedly asked his readers, this PhD, because it's what he was, asked the readers and the folks who read those books and shared those books understand that white Southerners believed that they were confronting criminals, demons. And then they had to decide how severely that they were required to judge them and to inflict violence on them, up to include cutting parts of their bodies off and burning them for hours. We can simply call Winfield Collins an apologist. We can note that the racism in his book and everything, we could just move on. But that would prevent us from learning how these apologists and these apologetics work. Apologetics is a real thing. It is a broad sense that shows us how they reason their defense and their position, no matter how violent. That word is familiar in things like theology, because Christian apologetics, for example, refers to the argument defending Christian belief. We are using that term to examine how a social system defends itself intellectually. An apologist does not always deny that an abuse happened. No. In fact, what they do, right, is they make a durable form of apologetics, and they concede that the abuse and the violence had to happen and that it had cause. They say, oh, lynching may be wrong, but what about the crime that they did? Disenfranchisement may be regrettable, but what about political incompetence? Segregation may have seemed harsh, but what about what it did for social stability? Or as one congressman said, put the black family together. Racial domination may have been imperfect, but what alternative did they have to keep blacks in order? That's the apologetics. That's the foolery. And Collins gives us that reasoning in an unusually visible form in his book when he discusses black political citizenship after the Civil War. He argued that one of the great mistakes of Reconstruction was granting black men and women freedom, but more so black men voting rights before they were actually adult enough to understand them. He neglects the fact that black people in black towns got together in black churches with their families, with their wives, and even though the one black man had to vote, they came together collectively to decide how the family would vote. He neglected that. He wanted to think about white tutelage, meaning that they should have had supervision. They should have been told in a different way, right? Just a master in a different way. And let's understand something. Tutelage is not inherently a racial concept. Now, we do tutelage all the time. We place children under guardianships. We place children in school. We place them in places where they can get tutelage. But Collins converts that tutelage to a human condition that has a racial hierarchy. Black adults become political children, and racial groups don't have authority if you're not white. The move is psychological. It is not just political. And it is important. If black citizens are understood to not have the adult thoughts and cognitive possessions, then they shouldn't have the exact civil rights of a white adult. They shouldn't be allowed to walk freely in our community because they're adults. They don't have the brains for it. They're politically and socially immature dependents, and they receive power too early. That's patronalism. That's when a social group or a political party or people place limits on another people on how they are free and what they can do, and restricts their movement and their welfare. And all of that plays into this lynching idea. The same white political class claiming that black people are not ready to vote stood to regain political control over those black people by teaching them what they should do. And this is where the historical argument becomes very, very important, but complicated, because it shows us that there are different levels. It's not just political. It's not just psychological. It's not just individual prejudice. The removal of black political power was not merely an attitude. It acquired legal architecture. William Archibald Dunning, who taught a whole generation of professors, including some presidents of the United States, became foundational in what later historians called the Dunning School of Thought. He gave remarkable revealing accounts of tutelage, of paternalism, and the idea that blacks should not have their own self-awareness, their own ways of designating what they should and what they could not do. And when you create a mindset like that, you teach people to disenfranchise. You disenfranchise people. You take away their rights. You effectively deny their ability to vote. We always look at disenfranchisement as a voting thing, but it's deeper than that. You take away their ability to choose who's going to be over their communities in their communities. You choose their sheriffs, their prosecutors, their judges, their law enforcement, their community. You choose where they live, how they transport, where they go. And when they violate that, because you've taught it in schools, in the Dunning School, you've taught it in schools and in books from recognized PhDs such as Collins. And so when people violate that, then you inflict upon them violence, and you justify that violence as an apologetic because you say they didn't do what we told them to do. Frederick Douglass was noted as rejecting the claim that black voting and black self-determination produce bad government and bad culture. In his Why is the Negro Lynch, he argued that the deeper political disorder arose actually from restricting black suffrage rather than extending it. He challenged that the repeated assertion that black ignorance justified disenfranchisement by demanding evidence that black voters had actually imposed the political disasters that were later attributed to them, and not the fact of whites who were angry that blacks were voting. Douglas's approach was methodical as well as political, but it was methodical because if black voting is said to cause social disorder, if black self-determination is said to show that there is a challenge and a threat, it shows the causal connection rather than assuming it. Causal is important. Causal is important. It matters. Causation means that one factor contributed to producing another. It is different from correlation, which simply means that two things occur together. No, causation means something caused another to happen. If violence follows black political participation, black cultural self-determination, then their self-determination caused the violence. That is where our problems are. Even when we go back and touch again on Wells's case, Nolan Wells's case, how dare his family ask for another autopsy? How dare his family ask questions? Self-determination should not be something that causes you to act violently. But in fact, historically, that has been the case. Later in Collins' book, he attributes black poverty in substantial ways to what he describes as black character, black disposition, black socialization, and training. He uses these anecdotes about workers and he generalizes them in a way to, again, make them justifiable victims of lynching. And it is an example of racial essentialism. It is a clear example of that, where you assume that complicated social outcomes can be explained by fixed traits, supposedly inherited things that go into these racial groups. If poverty is explained primarily as a product of Black character, if violence and sexuality is explained as a problem of Black character, then what do you expect from them? Robert Shufelt, who wrote America's Greatest Problem, The Negro, he published that in 1915, and he himself, and another book, Menace to Society, or The Black Man, A Menace to American Society, where they institutionally packaged us as violent criminals, as deviant sexual criminals, where they classified our women as lascivious, whorish, and then justified whatever they did to them based on those assumptions. Shufelt repeatedly treats supposed mental differences between the racial groups, his perceived mental differences, as an excuse to put down Black people in the way that you may put down a dog. And we ask why these things continue, why these things are still in our society. When Ida B. Wells goes into the Red Record and she makes the contradiction, right, of how the newspapers, how the media, how people use these taught ideas to create Southern horrors, to do things and create violence, to drag Black men and women out into fields, into train track areas. In 1892, she recorded 241 total lynching victims. Of that 241, 160 of them were identified as Black. The idea that Black people did not suffer more from lynching than any other racial group is absurd. And then when she looked at the evidence, you will find that fewer than 1/3 had ever been charged. You will look at the statistics and understand that there was a deeper argument of why we felt we should do this. Because see, once that confirmation bias, as I told you earlier, our bias, our tendencies that we readily accept, once that's established, along with our stereotypes and our biases and bigotry, people move on that. Groupthink takes place, and people start to go and harm others. This is why it is so important for us to understand why we have to challenge these narratives, why we have to be able to ask questions, and why it should be unfortunate that someone should be able to tell you that you don't have the right to question what happens to your Black child or your son, daughter, or whoever. That should never be the case. Because we have allowed this country to establish a thing where suspicion becomes authority. Suspicion becomes authority. That's a crazy thing, isn't it? By the time we get beyond into our modern age, we start to see how that became a major thing and how it's dramatically different in a lot of ways. A private citizen cannot legally assemble a crowd, seize a person out of a jail, declare them guilty, and then put them to death. Because every American citizen possesses constitutional protections. Murder remains a serious crime, regardless of whatever your race, sex, or whatever is. Federal civil rights laws and hate crime statutes create forms of accountability that did not exist back in the 1890s. Yet, the cases haven't gone away. We still are seeing racial cases. And we got to begin looking at the law, because public conversations about these cases often collapse. They collapse into pointing fingers, and they lose the legal concepts. Self-defense is always thrown out there in certain cases. But who gets to claim self-defense? Who gets to say, yes, I stood my ground, and who doesn't? If a bully attacked me, or a person attacked me, and I defended myself and it caused their death or significant harm, was I not defending myself? What about the defense of others? That's a legal term that says you have the right to protect another person if you believe that they may have death or physical harm. What about defense of property? There are limitations, but you have the right to defend your property. But here's the thing. It all depends on who you are and what is accepted by the system. And those distinctions are philosophically important as well as legally important. Your property matters because you invest your time and air. But what about the people in the South who had their properties taken from them, had their homes burned, that were ran out of town, and then had racist whites take those properties that are still within those families' possessions today? What about the store owner who was worried about repeated theft, right, and thought he was going to have economic harm? Does that give him the right to go chase a white kid out of a store and shoot him in the back? Absolutely not. Most people will say that's absurd. But we've had cases after cases of Black children being assaulted and some killed for a perception of theft. Nowhere has anybody looked at the legal term proportionality, which means the level of force used should bear reasonable relationship to the threat that you're confronting. If you weren't in and stole a cola from me, that doesn't mean that I should be able to kill you. I may be able to punch you or push you down or whatever, but nowhere should I be shooting you in the back. And that may seem obvious, or it should, but it's not obvious. It's not obvious because we're seeing more and more of this. We're seeing more and more of this. When 14-year-old Cyrus Belton in South Carolina was shot in the back because the Asian man believed, the store owner believed Cyrus had threatened his son. But wait a minute. They said he chased him out because they thought he was shoplifting. But when that suspicion didn't work, then they went into, self-defense, defense of others. But nowhere are Blacks historically given the idea of proportionality. Black man goes into a white town, into a sundown town. He's just driving or traveling through there. He's assaulted, physically harmed, almost killed, simply because he's in the wrong place by their perception. And if he fights them back, historically, we've seen he had no right to self-defense. What about Cyrus's right to self-defense? If people are running after me and I didn't do anything wrong, don't I have the right, if I did have a weapon, to point that weapon and tell you to get away from me? These distinctions are important, and often they're left out. Often they're left out. And we run into this situation where we don't see it for what it is. We don't recognize it for what it is. And you may say tonight, you may be one of the people that will watch this and say, well, Eddie, out of all of this, what does this have to do with lynching? You said that this was going to be, lynching is not just one thing. And we have to define that. We have to define that. I told you earlier, it can't just be because someone is killed that's a lynching. That's not what we're saying. But we have to reach a point where language becomes evidence, where language becomes what it is. We can look at the transformation from slavery, emancipation, Jim Crow, and all of these things, even into our modern time. But before we move deeper, we have to look at into individual victims and the psychology of the crowd that killed them, or the people that killed them. We have to settle something that sounds simple to us when we say it, but a lot of people don't get it. What exactly are we calling a lynching? If you're watching this later, I want you to type it in, go down, when you go in the comments, what do you think a lynching is? See, because the question matters, especially for what we're talking about, because we want to be able to understand. If we use lynching merely as another word for a wrongful death of a Black person, then the term becomes so broad that it loses its historical precision. Every racially motivated murder then will become a lynching. Even unjustified police killings could become a lynching. Every suspicious death could become a lynching. That would make the word emotionally powerful, but historically weak. And it would prevent us from distinguishing between different forms of violence that may share some characteristics without being the same phenomena or the same situation. James Elbert Cutler wrote a book, Lynch Law, an investigation of the history of lynching in the United States. He wrote that book in 1905. Cutler did not begin with the assumption that lynching had always meant the racial murder of Black Americans. He traced the history of the word lynch and lynch law back to its actual founding, and he followed forms of extralegal punishment and how that had been done in American history since even before its founding. His purpose was sociological. He wanted to understand the conditions under which lynch laws operated. That historical distinction is important for tonight. Extralegal means outside the procedures authorized by law. You went in and you grabbed somebody out of a jail or under the custody of someone. And everyone should be given due process, right? Which means you have the right to be seen in court and be tried and found and be assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. But we've taken the word accused and used accused as an actual way of convicting someone. And why in books, the Ida B. Wells's works, the word accused had such a meaning. She repeatedly distinguished accusations from guilt. Her statistics did not simply tell us what people had done. It frequently told us what people were charged with, what they were accused of, suspected of, before the mob killed them. The categories themselves preserved that uncertainty was always there. An alleged rape, a suspicion of rape, an alleged murder, an alleged theft, an alleged assault. Think about what happens historically when we remove actual factual qualifiers. If a newspaper reports that a man was lynched for rape or lynched for murder, then people only see that he did that. Because the reader is going to assume that he did the crime. And he's going to see that the accusation is true because of the way it was written. Even if he had been convicted legally, tried legally. And Ida B. Wells understood that distinction. She understood that distinction. And this is also the reason why James Cutler wanted to make sure that that distinction was important too. We have allowed ourselves to forget what a lynching is. And I'm going to tell you what the definition of lynching is. Lynching has several different things. It's always going to be public. Most times it's public, not by the act of the lynching, but the use of killing someone to leave a message, to show people and to showcase. It's violent. Its desire is to show and communicate a message, to disenfranchise, to frighten, to make people feel less than. Lynching is not just something in criminal justice. It's not something that we can just codify in some ways as Cutler tried to. And Ida B. Wells tried to show that. When we pull a human being out of a jail and we burn them alive, when we dissect and take parts of that person's body, when we keep keepsakes, when we take pictures and send them in the mail as postcards, to a point where the American government had to create a law that made that illegal. And why we have so many lynch postcards in the Library of Congress. We have to understand that lynching is different, and how blacks look at it and how whites look at it. One may say a white man stole something, so he was killed. Another will say, well, a black man stole something. The police, the community, people, or whatever went and went after him, ran him down. The no-knock warrants. Coming to your house in the middle of the night. Coming in without a warrant. Putting your foot in the door. Things that a lot of white Americans don't understand and don't see. Stopping you in your car while you're driving in the middle of the night because you just happened to be in the wrong place by their determination. And we get back to that idea of causality, right? This would have never happened if you weren't in that area. This would have never happened if we didn't assume. I had to tell my children years ago that when we would go to the store, and we would go to the store like a Walmart or whatever, and we would walk to go out of the store, and the alarms would go off. And 3 or 4 white people would walk straight past us. They never stopped. They were going out of the door the same time we did. Even though we knew we had purchased everything, we stopped. We allowed them to look at our receipt. Even though we knew we stole nothing, to avoid the idea of causality, to avoid the apologetics, to avoid the idea of wrongdoing or the perceived perception of wrongdoing. And how many of those other people have walked out and stolen something? How many of you, Black and brown folks out here were told by your parents and by different people, when you go to a store in a certain area and you're followed through the store, that's just a part of it. And so you're very careful of what it is you're getting and what it is you need to get, and then you get out. I had a friend that I went to school with, white guy, and he would go into a store with us and he would rob it blind. And I would always say to him, man, how much, you took a lot of stuff out of there. Because, and he told me, he said, well, while they were watching you, man, they wasn't paying no attention to me. And I'm always purchasing what I needed to purchase. Getting back to the idea of lynching, these things happen because of causality. These things happen because somebody thought it in their mind that it was acceptable to kill someone based on an accusation, even when you knew it was a lie. Even when you knew. We often look at lynching as hanging. Hanging was common, but it didn't define lynching. A lot of times Black people were shot, burned, beaten, mutilated, stabbed, dragged across the ground, displayed in the public. Police, courts, authorities did nothing. You need to go and read Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors and Red Record. You need to go and pull up, and I'm going to put that in the on our YouTube comments. You need to go pull up James Elbert Cutler's book, Lynch Law. You need to go read Robert Schufelt's books. Even though they're disgusting and deplorable, you need to understand what created these thoughts and how they are still being used against us today. How they still affect us today. And why it's so important that we understand these things as our children go through this. Because when the state possesses the authority to use deadly force, then you run into this idea again. What is the message that's being received? Recently, we had a 1-year-old baby shot in the head and killed because there was a belief that the mother was shoplifting. Causality. And when people come out of these ideas that have become so deeply enrooted in our society, in our teaching, in our tutelage, it's hard for us, for some of us, to let those things go. We will kill for what is considered to be shoplifting. I go in stores now and they have things locked all up in cabinets. Doesn't matter what store you go into. And if you're going to kill somebody for $1.25 bottle of whatever, how crazy have we gotten? Cops are shooting into cars and completely ignoring the legal standard of probable cause. You have to have facts and circumstances sufficient enough to give reasonable person the grounds to believe that a crime has occurred. That is probable cause. And then at the same time, you can't escalate because of probable cause, because I thought he stole a cucumber, so I shot him dead in front of the store. Those cases become really important when we look at people like Eric Gardner being choked out on the street and killed. When we look at George Floyd being held down and with a knee on his neck, and then people arguing that the person that did it should be given freedom, when that person made an assumption. And if this man was high, or if any of the things that you say out here were true, he is the officer is under a different standard to ensure the well-being of that person he's trying to arrest. They are in his, thus meaning the legal term, custody. He doesn't have the right to publicly lynch him by putting his knee on his neck until he chokes out and dies, to send a message to everybody watching and filming that I am in authority. Lynching, murder, the destruction of Black lives has been around since the beginning of this country. And it has gotten no better because we refuse to look at the systems and the history behind it. I only have an hour and a half when I come on with you all. But I do my best to try to give you some of the system and some of the structure. I do my best to do the best I can to break it out for you. Suspicion should never be authority. It should never be a point where I'm going to harm you based on a suspicion. Now we're at a point where we don't even call things that are lynchings, lynchings. If we find Black bodies hanging in the woods, we say they self-harmed themselves. We don't look at the facts. We don't go for the conclusion. And when the Black people, if that person's family or loved ones say this needs to be investigated, we have a whole section of apologetics who come out and say, absolutely not. He probably did it to himself. This is part of their culture. This is who they are. They lie and they perform and ignore all of the things I told you earlier. Because it's an attempt to make a racial hierarchy, right? And push it to us as knowledge, as wisdom, as understanding. We don't have the right or the knowledge or the understanding or the legal understanding to challenge that. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. You have to have these things in law, your probable cause. You have to remove your implicit bias. You can't just go off of what you think you understand in order to harm someone. Now, I say this, but it's not clueless. I'm not clueless on that. So as we look at Nolan Wells' case, as it further develops, you are absolutely right to ask what happened to your son. What is the manner of death? What are the circumstances? We are not living in a hierarchy that takes that right away from you, despite what some people will tell you online, or pundits will say with their biases and their racism. I don't care if they're the governor of Mississippi, the mayor of whatever. They don't have that right to do that. We are free. We are citizens. We are the children, the African-American or the Black American is the children of the slave. Call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. Call yourself an FBA, call yourself whatever you want to call you. But in the end of the day, your ancestors endured, fought for you to have the rights that you have. They marched. Some burned, some were shot, some hung. For you to have the rights that you have right now. Don't deny it to yourself. Don't get on the bandwagon of saying someone doesn't have the right to question what happened to their child. While on the other end, when it is a white child or a child that is not within that culture, you're absolutely fine with it. Not only are you a hypocrite and you're biased, but you show you really don't care. Not about the history, not about the law, not about anything. You have your own bias. You have your own established understanding of what you think is right and what you think is wrong. There is a difference between private murder and a social system of killing. Private murder may be a person that goes in and kills someone that they know. A social system of killing means that you are using everything within that society that permits it to harm or kill with impunity. And I gave you those words tonight on purpose. I made very sure that the words that I used tonight were precise. Don't bend to your confirmation bias. And if you want to remember what that is, again, I will tell you. Don't notice, interpret, or remember information in ways that support your biases. When you find yourself doing that, pull back. Ask the question, wait a minute. I know how I feel. But what are the facts? There's nothing wrong with that. But when facts show you or start to establish, don't become a sellout aligner. Don't become a performer to be obsequiously entertaining and supporting people who are going to give you money, give you access in order for you to lie about what you see out here. Because here's the thing, when I see this happen a lot with Black people, you're going to, if you have children, nephews, cousins, nieces, family, how do you perpetuate a foolery like that, knowing they have to live in a world where you have excused and made apologetics for that? I don't care who you are, officer, whatever that's out here. I don't care any of these guys that are out here being apologetic to what is going on and not allowing people to have the rights that they have. How dare you? Causality, right? The idea of, well, he was doing this, or maybe he had a gun, or maybe all of those things that you use as an excuse to justify the death of a Black person has a historical meaning, has history behind it. And you're not new to it. You're just a current participant. Stop. You're not going to listen to me. You're going to keep doing it because it satiates whatever you're trying to get or get to. And I hope it's worth it. I hope it's worth it for you to sell your soul. But it's disgusting. And it needs to stop. I'm going to get ready to get out of here. I enjoyed this episode. It was a lot. I could have unpacked a lot more. But I wanted to give you something to think about more than anything. And I'm open to your questions, your responses, anything you get from this episode, because we're just getting back. But, you know, it's just important for us to look at it and understand it. When a Black person dies under unusual, violent, or disputed circumstances, why does the possibility of lynching still enter into our conversation? It's our historical memory. We have to ask the question. We have to understand, is this what they say it is? After everything that we examined tonight, I think we can see some of this a little bit more clearly. I think we can see that the answer is more complicated than fear, politics, mistrust, sellouts. Black Americans inherited a documented history in which accusation could become punishment, could become racial mythology, could cause them to be killed, could give justification to violence from people and institutions. The same institutions that were supposed to provide protection participated in the violence, tolerated the violence, and failed to hold anyone accountable, sometimes ever. But history also requires us to discipline ourselves. That's what I wanted to talk about tonight. We cannot take what happened to Emmett Till, Thomas Moss, George Lee, Michael McDonald, James Byrd Jr., Ahmaud Arbery, and thousands of other documented victims, and use their deaths to manufacture conclusions. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask questions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't ask questions about Nolan Wells, Daniel Erving, Tyler Smith, Kohen Wiley. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge what is being said. That would violate the very principle that Ida B. Wells, that W.B. Du Bois, that Carter G. Woodson, and others fought for, but particularly Wells, because she challenged America to investigate the accusations and look for the facts rather than surrender to opinion. I hope you go and get her book. Go read The Red Record and Southern Horrors. If there's anything you take from this lesson tonight, go do that. Lynching was never merely a rope hanging from a tree with a body. It existed inside of a system of law, politics, economics, psychology, physiology, ideology, religion, media. It silenced and repressed communities. It gave power to other communities. These systems haven't changed that dramatically, and they deserve further examination, more than what we have to be able to do tonight. But understanding that difference is important on how we honor the history that has been given to us and left for us without abusing it. Go do your study. I will make sure that we put those books in our YouTube and on our Facebook pages so you can go and grow your knowledge. I would ask you again, if tonight's discussion challenged something you thought you knew, open up a way of thinking that you hadn't thought about, I want you to subscribe, share the Erudition Network. I want you to go out and get my book, The Erudition Network Presents 101 Black History Question Challenge on the Early World. It was built around that same principle as Ida B. Wells of questioning what we have been taught and following those questions to factual sourced history. Those books contain hundreds of sources and books that are recommended for you to read within every question. And it was done on purpose. And it's supported by those multiple sources, every question and every answer, because knowledge should lead us toward deeper understanding, deeper questions, and not simply allow us to make assumptions that we share with others and misinform and disinform others. I want you to learn. It's one of the things with the Erudition Network. We want to try to learn together. We want to push knowledge and understanding. Again, I'm Eddie Phillips. This was the Erudition Network interactive Black History session. I thank you for spending this hour and a half with me thinking about everything that I talked about. Keep questioning, keep reading, keep growing. Thank you all for joining us. God willing, I will be back with you all next week. Keep asking what happened. Keep delving into those systems. Join us. Oh, before I get out of here, we're going to try to start something new. Get on the Facebook groups. We're going to try to start something new where we do a group call with about 20 people coming up here and talking to them. I tried to get people to do it. Ask a historian, sit down for about an hour just on a call through Facebook and be able to ask questions that you may have. Be looking for that. Join us. All right, guys. I'll see you next time. You all have a really good one. You be blessed. Let me get on out of here. Thank you.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.